Welcome to Colliers Talks, a podcast series featuring the latest trends, insights, research, and developments in commercial real estate in Canada and beyond.
Hello, welcome to the Colliers Talks podcast. I'm Adam Jacobs. I'm the head of Canada Research at Colliers, and I'm very happy to be joined by my guest, Stan Ivankovic from Environics Analytics. Stan is the Vice President of Business Development. I've known him for a number of years. You may know him from real estate forums, conferences, and many industry events. He helps real estate and retail clients understand their markets, trade areas, and customers, tailoring projects, data, and software engagements to meet the needs of each and every client. Stan, we're big users of your data, but introduce the audience to Environics. What role does your team play in the Canadian real estate industry?
Yeah, so Environics Analytics is the premier data and analytics company based here in Toronto, Canada. We have a few thousand clients across all industry sectors and practices. Our team focuses on real estate, both commercial and residential real estate. And our team helps our clients better understand trade areas, customers, and various trends using our data as well as their data.
Okay. And it's always helpful to have an example, data and demographics. How is it used in development, in marketing, in a big residential project? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, a residential developer would oftentimes use our data to better understand some of the planning of amenities, but also look at any trends that are happening in the area, who's moving into areas, who's moving out of areas, what's the growth in the area. From a marketing standpoint, a residential developer would want to understand who are those prospective residents. So not just attaching some of the quant numbers behind them, but also the qual. What are their behaviors? Where would you find them in their spare time? What types of media do they engage with? But also, what are their psychographics? Do they care about the environment? Do they care about technology and so forth? So there's various use cases there for sure in terms of the residential side.
Love it. Okay. I think Environics is known to most people for the demographic data they provide. This is the income, the education, the language spoken, all that. There's a whole new vanguard of data around mobility and phones and everything. But let's start with demographics. Hot topic right now. Maybe normally kind of like a background issue we know about, aging population or something. But demographics is front page news. The population was 40 million. Now the population's 41 million. And that only took 8 or 9 months or whatever. So, we're at record high growth. There's this crazy level of population growth. What do you see as the biggest impacts of this in the real estate world or just generally?
Yeah, so we've welcomed a lot of new Canadians over the last couple of years. In fact, record numbers of new Canadians, and not all new Canadians are of the same sort of class of some of the historical new Canadians in terms of being just permanent residents. We welcomed a lot of temporary residents over the last couple of years. Last year, 1.3 million alone. So the differences amongst the folks coming to Canada in terms of their needs, their diversity, their background, and their incomes is quite different. But to sort of answer some of that questioning, there is, the idea really is we have more immigrants. We're going to have more labor for various requirements in our economy, more spend on retail in various categories, and so Canada has been one of the fastest growing economies in the OECD in the Western world, and population growth is helping to fuel that.
And it's not evenly distributed though. Like we certainly see the population boom here in Toronto, but talk to me about Ontario versus Quebec or Western Canada versus Eastern Canada. Like where is there maybe an extra or disproportionate impact of all the population?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so traditionally, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver capture the vast majority of our immigration, whether it be permanent residents, temp residents, or asylum seekers. What has happened over the last few years, however, is we've seen a lot of immigration to secondary or tertiary cities across Canada. And so these populations in these areas have seen rapid growth in certain cities where you've seen immigration come into certain areas. And Alberta is a good example of that. Calgary has really started to outpace a lot of other major cities in terms of growth, not just because of immigration, but also interprovincial migration. And, one would have expected that with the resource sector facing all the challenges it faced over the last few years here in Canada, that we would see the exact opposite trend out in Alberta, and yet we're seeing record growth numbers in many places in Alberta.
Yeah, certainly a trend we have our eye on, more on the internal Canada, people leaving Ontario, relocating to Alberta, relocating to Nova Scotia, relocating to the prairies. You can say it's still a small level. It's, maybe it's 30 or 40,000 people a year. There's tens of millions of people, but it's people voting with their feet, right? Or just like, it's really notable that Alberta is kind of the last vanguard of affordability. There's just nowhere to run anymore in Ontario, in BC. So do you see that as part of the story there, just the cost of living crunch everywhere?
Yes, yeah. We track movement within Canada, and also new Canadians on a quarterly basis, and some of the trends that we're seeing is those markets have grown. Also, markets within Ontario have pushed up prices, of course, in places like Collingwood, Wasaga Beach, Kitchener-Waterloo, London, many other cities in Ontario. And so we're seeing actually sort of two dichotomies in terms of folks leaving the Toronto CMA or CSD. And a lot of times those are young families starting out, as well as boomers downsizing. So it's sort of a real dichotomy in terms of life stage. And although you're absolutely right, the numbers, I think people focus a lot on the radio ads when Alberta was putting out ads to draw out Ontarians. I think people think it's an enormous number, and I think it's not that big as well. People do move out of Alberta as well. And so that's a number that folks also need to take a look at, is people do migrate out of Alberta for various reasons. Of course, people from Ontario and BC are moving at high rates, but people also move out. So important to look at that too.
Certainly. Yeah. Hot topic. So bring us back to, this is a real estate podcast. There's some big demographic changes, high immigration, aging population at the same time. Who's benefiting in the real estate side from that? Like a region, a sector? Where do you see the growth on the real estate side?
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, immigration and population growth floats all boats in real estate asset classes. Whether it's helping out office demand, whether it's residential real estate or retail, certainly, or industrial, of course, which needs no help over the last couple of years. But I would say for sure that it's not so much the outright numbers to look at. It's actually the changes in retail behavior that we're going to see with this immigration over the next few years. We're going to see, certain countries or of origin hugely represented within the Canadian population. And that's going to shift how people consume things, how people shop, the services that we need. So I think ideally, it's going to continue to grow our economy, grow our labor pool. We have a huge lack of skilled trades that I know that you know a lot more about than I do. But these are the things that immigration is hopefully helping us from a supply side.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you see it most clearly in areas like residential, where it's like, if you're coming from another country, you're not living with mom and dad, you need someplace to live. There's a huge demand for apartments. Industrial is kind of also related of, you need stuff, you order things from Costco and Amazon, and the warehouse economy booms. Retail and office are a little less in favor these days, but I agree with your view that this should still be a tailwind for those assets, right? Even office, we talk about population growth benefiting all these areas. Nobody ever says it benefits office, but if I'm looking forward and saying there's going to be 5 million more people in Canada in a few years, surely some of them have to come downtown, work in an office. They came here for an education, and now they want a job at tech, accounting, law firm, bank. It's not as direct a connection, but is it fair to say, am I being too optimistic to say retail and office, which are, a little down historically, can also benefit from this?
Yeah, 100%. And so, I think also our economy is for sure cyclical. And so We're gonna need these spaces downtown and in offices. We're gonna have new businesses opening up. There's gonna be new sectors that are gonna start to grow out of our economy. Aging population, we're gonna need a lot more healthcare services. And I think when most people think about healthcare services, they think about someone in a hospital. But the reality is we're gonna have tens of thousands of people needed to work in white-collar, office-like healthcare jobs. And so we're going to need innovation in those sectors too, R&D. And so those are all areas that I think we're going to see big investments in Canada.
Now, let's talk about the flip side of that a little bit, which is every day you read in the paper, not just the population boom, but the housing crisis, the housing shortage. And I always say, I feel a bit down. You read these numbers and they seem impossible. We need 2 million houses, 3 million houses, 4 million houses. Like it just a number that almost can't be reached. So development can't keep pace right now for whatever reason with how many homes we need. So what do you want to emphasize, or what's your view on like population growth meets housing crunch? This is going to ease somehow. We're going to find a way to build faster, or is it just a matter of larger and larger households, more and more people living together, some changes on that side?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a hot topic right now, and it was covered extensively at quite a bit of extent in the budget, the federal budget. There have been some incentives, and the GST came off purpose-built rental. I believe there's been some increases in CCA that have come down the pipe for purpose-built rental. There have been some incentives to help out, but the absolute demand and with our population growth for student housing, seniors housing is going to continue to increase. I don't see there being a solution in terms of a short-term fix to any of those items. I don't see municipalities or governments building houses fast. I don't think they've done this historically at high numbers. And I think developers and the REITs are going to be the ones that ultimately can produce that supply or develop homes. There's a lot of things that, in terms of municipalities that I think developers have been talking about for a long time. And one of those is certainly the time to get an approval. And ultimately, with all the incentives taking place, if we need to reach the goal line by 2030 or 2035 in terms of a set number of houses, we've got to speed up our approvals. We are 3 times longer than the US. We are 37 out of 38 in the OECD in terms of the approval time. So we're not doing well on the scoreboard in terms of moving ahead development permits right now, whether it's NIMBYism, whether it's zoning, whether it's various other bureaucratic things. But I know I might be preaching to the choir when I say this, but I think the municipalities in that process really needs some changes and some kickstarting.
Oh, I agree. And I said to someone just yesterday, go to any real estate conference and you just hear the same conversation. We have to speed up approvals in Toronto. I said, I've been going to these conferences for years. I don't think they've speeded up at all. I think they might even be slower than they used to be for a number of factors, supply and demand, staffing, whatever. So that's why I want to feel hopeful here, but I'm like, this discussion has been going on forever, certainly since before COVID. I mean, it's not like, oh, this is an anomaly because of lockdown or the last couple of years. So there's probably a bigger discussion there of how that can happen, because I feel like this discussion is maybe decades in the making at this point.
I would agree. And I think, this is a personal opinion here, but I do believe when you talk to folks anecdotally who are not in the industry, which I mean is always a good thing to, at the cocktail party or the barbecue, to chat with folks who don't know a lot about the real estate development side of things. You might not hear things that you want to hear in terms of the perception of the industry. And I feel like there is an immense opportunity for developers to inform the public, make the public aware of all the great things that developers are doing, and also the burden that is shared amongst developers in terms of taxes and fees that amount to almost 1/3 of every new home that's built in Canada, or depending on the province, less or more. So I do think there's an opportunity for some ground up public relations awareness campaigns for the industry to talk to Canadians about how important developers and the REITs are in this solution, which ultimately will be them solving the problem. Governments will not solve this problem. They can help grease the wheels and facilitate some of this, but developers will be the ones building homes.
That's an interesting point. Yes, there is maybe a perception gap between how we see it from here versus the general public. So a couple more on demographics, and I want to get to retail, one of your many specialties. But let me tie this back to, okay, people are moving out of big cities to secondary markets, tertiary markets. They're relocating to Alberta. This is tied to the job market and our new reality of remote work. Or do you see this as largely driven by, I can now work from home and I have options that I didn't have before? Or is it more just about the affordability side? I just can't afford a house in Toronto and that's it, and I'll go until I can? Or is it more about, I now have flexibility that 5 years ago we just didn't imagine?
It's all the above and more. So it's a multifaceted situation in terms of retail demand, and we track foot traffic to all the malls and retailers across Canada and the U.S. And what we do see is that there's certain asset classes doing better than others. We also track workplace visits, and of course, there's been some migration outside of the downtown cores. Workplace visits have not returned back to 2020 or 2019 levels, especially in places like Toronto. Toronto is still lagging, and Canada as a whole is lagging most of our OECD compatriots. The other challenge here is that, when you look at some of the retail assets that are downtown, a lot of them get their visits and their spend from folks who work in these areas. And so just like the area we're in here right now, Union Station has built out a gorgeous concourse section with retail. And, these are the areas, and we've got Eaton Center down the street as well. These are the areas that are actually seeing a concentration of residents visiting their malls versus workers visiting their malls over the last year or so. So we're seeing actually a shift of the demographic as well as the geographic visitor to malls in downtown areas and in urban areas across the country. And it's really sort of concentrated amongst those people who actually live in the area, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We continuously talk about that sort of 15-minute city. It's idealistic, of course, but generally speaking, we want people to shop where they live. And I think we're on that path. And so it's going to take some time, but to sort of answer the question about hybrid work, there's a lot of debate around how productive people are. And my mindset here is, yes, people are productive working from home because they don't have to deal with Toronto traffic or traffic or other issues like that and commuting, but are they innovative working from home? And I think this is where I disagree with a lot of the surveys and data that's being pulled out there. I don't think people are innovative working from their home office. And I think this is really going to impact Canadians long term. We're seeing our productivity drop in Canada. It's been a trend for a while. This was happening pre-COVID as well. But I really think that, to be innovative, people need to be in office working as a team.
The push-pull about returning to the office has kind of ended in a stalemate, is my view. I think 2 years ago, I felt like full return to office was maybe in the cards. I really don't feel that way anymore. Just it doesn't seem, as you say, employees like work from home. And I think we have to acknowledge many employers like work from home also for the cost savings, because they themselves don't want to be in on Friday, whatever the situation is. An agreement has been reached. The longer term question of, is this good? Does this work? I think there's also some interesting implications we haven't yet seen, which is, I won't name the occupier, but a large prominent Canadian company. We were talking to them and they said, we have all these employees who have relocated to Barrie.
Okay.
We can't realistically get all these people downtown. It's just not happening. It takes too long. It's too expensive. We're considering opening an office in Barrie.
Wow.
Wouldn't that, which is not, Barrie is not necessarily set up for that. It doesn't necessarily have a huge office inventory, but the kind of second effects of this relocation, and we find ourselves in a situation where return to office just isn't possible. If you move to London from Toronto, there just isn't a path to coming back to Bay Street 4 days a week. So perhaps there's ripples in those secondary markets that we haven't seen yet on the development side, on the leasing side. I'm not sure. That's a little more speculative. It's
Yep.
one example, but I think that raised my eyebrow a little bit. Okay, retail. We're big users of your wonderful footfall tool, which tracks all sorts of brands and sectors and individual locations, what's up, what's down. So from your view, what's hot right now? What sectors in terms of rising demand, more foot traffic, then benefiting from the immigration boom? Like what's an area on the upswing? We hear so much negativity on retail, and retail has been dying for at least the last 15 years and seems to have 9 lives and is still here. So what are you seeing?
And it still will be here for a very, very long time. And so I'll answer your question. I would say, one thing is that generally speaking, whether it's, you'll hear it from retailers themselves or mall operators and landlords, people when they are shopping these days or visiting malls and retailers, they're much more purposeful. So, our data tells part of the story, but it doesn't tell the full story in terms of the folks that are coming into the malls and the retail strips. They're spending more. They're more purposeful in their visit. And so that's a very positive sign. So it's not just all about the foot traffic. And I know the marketing folks back in my office won't like that answer, but we don't have the full story here in terms of just the foot traffic. The categories that we're seeing some jumps in, of course, ones that you wouldn't be surprised in, shoes. People are buying shoes. So maybe people weren't showing their shoes when they were on camera the last couple of years at home in their Zoom calls. And so shoe retailers are doing well in terms of foot traffic. Cosmetics is doing well. We've seen, dollar discount type stores survive well through the pandemic in terms of foot traffic and also starting to expand out. So there's a number of retail categories that are doing well. As you know, hardware and some of those were doing well all throughout the pandemic for various reasons. And so they continue to do quite well. So we are seeing strength in a few sectors really jumping up. A lot of people bought pets over the pandemic. And so pet stores are doing extremely well. Probably no surprises there as well. So a lot of the categories I think that anecdotally we think should be doing well are doing well.
That's interesting. Pets is one I hadn't considered. And you mentioned like variety store, dollar store, kind of discount retail. That was something that jumped out to us, which is those areas are they're thriving, but is that negative story? Is that inflation pushing down people's spending power? Like I think there is that part of the story, right? We've just gone through a huge inflation shock. Prices for food, rent, whatever are at record highs, and that has to have some trickle down to the retail world, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. You're absolutely right. I mean, anecdotally, I heard somebody mention this. I was in London, Ontario a couple of weekends ago, and it was in a dollar store getting some supplies for an event, and the woman behind me said, there was a long lineup of people. This was a Sunday early afternoon, and the woman said, this is the new Costco. And for whatever reason, that one's kind of stuck with me. And I was like, well, what did she really mean by that? And so I tried to kind of deconstruct it. But, generally speaking, whenever we see some headwinds in the economy, folks might retract from their typical shopping behaviors to a discount brand. And so this might be the start of that. We might start to see people move back from some of the typical grocery brands that they have affinity with, and maybe going towards some of the discount grocery brands. And I think it'll be interesting to really look at this over the next few months, because we already see some of the economic indicators telling us that.
That's interesting. Let me pivot a bit to a topic where you do a lot of work: tourism, travel. One other area with a crazy boomerang lockdown, no travel. Then the next year, we're reading about people are sleeping on the floor of Pearson Airport for 30 hours to get that trip to Italy or France because they just can't wait anymore. It's evening out. We're getting a bit more to normal. tell me about that, and tell me is tourism and retail kind of go hand in hand to some degree? Like how's that impacting the retail world?
It's hard to measure exactly the impact of tourism on retail in sort of a micro way, but macro, there's obviously a lot of data behind this. The return of international visitors and American visitors to Canada from a tourism standpoint has been quite strong. We are seeing Canadians, especially cruising. Cruising has really taken off. Canada is, I think, globally right now, number 5 or number 6 in terms of future growth, in terms of international cruising market. And so Canada is growing pretty quickly. We're seeing numbers like Heathrow going to have a record summer in terms of volume through the airport this summer. I think it was 82 million passengers are going to be going through Heathrow this summer. So for sure, tourism numbers are bouncing back. It is interesting to note that certain countries aren't bouncing back for visitors to Canada. For example, China's dropped off. From a retail standpoint, a lot of the malls, for example, like a Yorkdale or a Sherway, where we would see high-end luxury type brands in these types of malls, how is that going to impact those malls? There was definitely, sort of a VIP type tourist visitors that, wanted that exclusive retail experience in some of those properties. And so as the Chinese visitors start to rebound, I'll be really curious to see how those numbers look for 2024. But certainly the 2023 numbers show a slow rebound from China, Australia, and other markets. But I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens this year.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Okay, we say retail, but retail is very multifaceted. What's really thriving? We talk like there's Main Street retail, there's your high-end malls, like you mentioned, your Pacific Center, Sherway Gardens, Yorkdale type malls. There's plazas and power centers, which were it during the pandemic. Okay, curbside pickup, basic retail, pharmacies, grocery stores. Like what's thriving right now? The high end, the low end, the middle, the convenience. Where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, convenience, suburban malls, power centers were doing extremely well throughout the pandemic when there was openings. So no news there in terms of there not really being a rebound, because they never really dipped off that badly for the most part. The regionals and super regionals have, for the most part, depending on the province or the region, have bounced back to 2019 levels. So they're doing fairly well. There's going to be some good news and some bad news stories depending on the province there. When we used to think about, classes for malls, for example, we used to think about them as regional, super regional, and the various definitions. But I feel like the tail of the tape here is more around urban mixed-use malls versus pretty much everything else. And that's where the story is not as positive, kind of echoing some of the comments earlier. Some of the downtown malls haven't benefited from the return to work yet, particularly in places like Ontario, where folks haven't been going back to the office at high rates, places like Ottawa, places like Toronto, where return to office, Moncton, return to office hasn't been as strong as some of the Western cities, for example. So that is a trend that for sure we're going to watch carefully through this year.
Okay, and tying this back to a bit where we started, huge all-time population boom, implications for national retail, different types of occupiers that are going to come in, different sectors that are going to thrive, or maybe a different approach from malls in terms of events, marketing. Like, where do you see those two things meeting up?
Yeah, so I mean, I got to say the experiential side of the malls has been talked about for a long time, and sort of the reinventing of the malls. I think it's really happening. I think I'm really starting to see it. We are seeing a lot more events taking place at malls, pop-ups, even things like bowling alleys, pickleball. Cloverdale, I think, just opened up a pickleball facility. So we are seeing the malls actually reinventing themselves. And I know this has been happening for a long time, but I feel like there's a bit of a perfect timing for a lot of these things to take place right now. So I think the experience in malls is going to continue to change. Culturally, going back to some of my earlier comments about immigration, I think we also need to track, some of the changes there. Over the next, 5 to 10 years, we're going to see doubling of some of the ethnic populations within Canada. And what are the needs of some of these ethnic populations? Filipino population, Canada's going to double in the next 10 to 15 years. And there's pockets of Canada where we have a huge concentration of some of these ethnic groups. So we're going to need to look at, how do we optimize our tenant mix in some of these properties? And that's going to change. The trend that isn't hot and sexy is the aging population. Because it's been going on for so long and it's taking a long time to happen, a lot of people really haven't been focusing on how do we need to change retail. We've talked about healthcare needs, accessibility needs. A lot of the municipalities and government sector have focused on this, but we haven't really heard retail talk too much about how do I make an experience for an active 75 or 85-year-old a little bit better in my mall. What are they going to be shopping for? What are their needs? And there's some obvious ones in terms of healthcare services and pharmaceuticals and other things like that. But gone are the days where 75-year-olds are inactive. They're very active these days. They're doing extreme cruises and extreme tours these days. This is a very different aging population. And so I'm very curious to see what retailers are going to be doing over the next few years to catch up to the needs of seniors and a very rapidly aging senior population.
That is interesting. Again, retail skews so young it's so youth oriented. You don't hear much about that. It's an interesting point. A little more meta, and I apologize, this wasn't on the prep, but to me, it's always stood out. Environics has been doing this a long time. The bread and butter was demographics derived from surveys, Statistics Canada, kind of official information, average age by submarket, that kind of thing. It's sometime in the last maybe 5 years, we entered this new era of data, mobility data, phone tracking, the ability to look at retail not based on surveys or a person clicking a counter walking in, but based off of tracking mobile devices and things. So do you see that as a fundamental shift in how we're going to do data collection in the future? Like, we still rely on just the basic demographics, but it seems like there's a huge world to explore with this mobility data, right?
Definitely. And I think there's a few reasons why is people want more data in a much quicker time frame in terms of updates. And so the demographic data that most of our clients are ingesting typically is updated annually. And there's some different estimates and projections that are done, but a lot of our clients are looking to get data much quicker. They're looking to get the data structured so that they can analyze it quickly and they don't have to spend a lot of time, playing with the data. And mobile movement data has really become a proxy for a visitor or shopper or customer data. As you know, a lot of the retailers, for example, their data is typically in legacy systems, hard to get at. And some of the landlords actually don't have any customer or shopper data themselves unless they have a loyalty program. And so mobile movement data has really allowed shopping malls and retailers to analyze shoppers in a privacy-friendly way. And I think that's really important as we continue to invest and move into mobile movement data, is that we focus on the privacy and the aggregation of this data and making sure that we're not re-identifying individuals. And so that's a big part of what we do. And so I think the mobile movement data has allowed us to become much more intelligent in terms of how do we draw a trade area, time of day analysis, but also things like cross-shop analysis, which we could never do before. And so it's allowed a lot more intelligence in terms of who that customer is, where are they coming from, but who are they in terms of their qualitative side.
And not to be negative, but do we see any pushback there? I always think of this, again, we're big users of Footfall.
Yeah.
It's aggregated, it's anonymous, but I remember showing this to someone and they said, we can't use this. I said, why not? They said, this can't be legal. I said, well, it's a new world. This is how we do it now. But I think there is a level of discomfort here.
Definitely.
People don't like this. We're still in the early stages of everyone has a phone and you're tracked all the time everywhere and location turned on. Like, is there a possible pushback, downswing coming here, or you just can't put the genie back in the bottle at this point?
There is pushback, and rightly so. Canadians and businesses need to, think about what are the implications of this type of data and using this data, and they need to do this for their own purposes, but also for their customers and their brand. And so, we know that there's been situations where there's been hacks and cyber attacks over the last few years that have really injured brands and individuals. And so this is one of the reasons why we went through the Privacy by Design certification recently, one of the few companies in Canada to do that. And throughout that process, we evaluated all of our mobile movement data to make sure we couldn't re-identify individuals, that it was anonymized, that it was aggregated, and that we're using the data in an intelligent way, but also in a very privacy-friendly way. And I welcome clients to challenge, us and other vendors in this area, because they should. They should always be asking questions of their own data sources, but also external data sources. So I'm a big believer in challenging any source of data that you're looking at, whether it's data that's being scraped off the internet, open source type data, or whether it's survey data. We should all be focusing on the privacy side of things too.
I agree. It's very exciting on the research side to have data that, as you say, you're not waiting 3 months for the next update. It's weekly data, and I'm sure for some people it's. I actually had a question. I showed someone football, and they said, "Okay, can I get down to this hourly level of I want to know that between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m." I said, "We don't have that, but I suspect it is possible to get down to that level, right? Like we can slice and dice this pretty fine, but still maintain anonymity. I don't see your individual identifying information, your name, where you live, that sort of thing, right?"
Yes, yeah, and de-aggregating or anonymizing data is something we've been doing for 20 years. So this is a process where we have safeguards in place so that folks can't be re-identified. And at the end of the day, at a certain point, you run into sample size issues as well. So you don't want to rely on data that is got a low sample size or not going to give you the insights that you want it to give you in terms of stability, as well as having a denominator to bounce it off. And so we do like to get into the details with our data, but we also want to ensure that it's reliable, it's stable, and it's privacy friendly.
Okay. And one more question. I apologize. This wasn't on the list either, but we always like the kind of outlook, like where do you see this all going? What are you looking for in the next 12 to 18 months type of question? Like this has been an all-time upheaval, not just in terms of lockdown, vaccine passport, vax mandate, but then inflation and supply chain and how that all is there a path to just sort of back to the normal trend of 5 or 6 years ago, or this is like a fundamental change that we're not going back from?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, right now there with, interest rates where they are, inflation somewhat stabilized, the big concern becomes the real estate market in terms of the residential real estate market. I think the numbers from this quarter were lowest new condo sales since 2009. So, some of the data coming out from Q1 on the residential real estate side, not the greatest. Retail spend numbers from Q1, particularly Toronto, not great. Looking at that nominally, maybe not a scary story, but when you start to look at it from a real standpoint and then adjust for pop growth, double-digit drops from year over year. So that's in Ottawa as well. So Toronto and Ottawa both kind of double-digit drops when you factor in inflation and pop growth. So there are some real concerns there. And if you ask businesses and the regions of boards of trade do ask these questions to their members, and you ask businesses, we've talked about this a year ago, couldn't get supply, couldn't get labor. And now a lot of these businesses are saying, we're worried about demand. And, wow, what a 180 from, a year or two ago when that was not even on the radar screen. And now it's, one of the big concerns that's rising the fastest in terms of some of the answers that some of the boards of trades businesses are saying. From a consumer sentiment, bit of a mixed bag that I've seen in some of the surveys that Statistics Canada and other firms have done. But essentially, some of the numbers aren't great, but it is also, you're seeing it being a little bit worse in Ontario and BC, actually. And so the retail spend numbers also echo that. So this is a little bit of a story of where Ontario right now seems to be leading the charge in terms of some of those negative indicators, both from businesses, individuals, and spend side of things. And the hope is that we can turn this around pretty quickly before it turns into not just a trend, but a real slide.
Excellent. That's all the time we have for this episode of Colliers Talks. A very special thank you to our guest, Stan from Environics Analytics, and thank you to our audience who joined us for this episode, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks for listening to Colliers Talks podcast. To learn more about Colliers Canada, our experts, and our solutions, visit collierscanada.com or find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook.